Snow swallowed sound that night. The wind roared down from the black mountains like a living thing, bending the pines and scouring the open range. A lone rider pushed through it, face half hidden behind a wool scarf stiff with frost. Her horse snorted clouds of steam into the air, hooves breaking the crusted drifts with dull thuds. Every step was a fight, but she kept going, her eyes fixed on the faint orange glow of home far across the valley. She rode alone because that was how she had learned to survive. Alone meant no one to bury. The storm eased for a breath. Through the white blur she heard something, a broken sound, half groan, half whisper. Her hand went to the rifle tied across her saddle. The wind picked up again, but the sound came once more, faint and human. She pulled the horse around, listening. Another moan, weaker. She dismounted, boots sinking to her shins, and walked toward the noise. The cold bit through her gloves as she pushed aside low pine branches heavy with snow. There, half buried, lay a man. His bare chest was marked with dried blood, an arrowhead lodged near his ribs. His hair was black, matted with ice, his skin copper-toned beneath the frost. His breath came shallow, his eyes flickering open to look at her without recognition or fear, just exhaustion. She knew from the markings on his arms what he was: Apache. The kind most white ranchers prayed never to meet on the open plains. But this one was dying. He tried to speak, voice cracking. "Go away," he rasped. "They'll kill you too." His words were barely carried by the wind. She stood still, breath trembling in the air between them. Every instinct told her to leave, to ride home and bar the door. But the sight of him, broken, left for dead in the snow, tugged something buried deep, something she'd spent years hardening against. She knelt, the leather of her coat creaking. "Then let him try," she said quietly. The man's eyes closed, not in peace but surrender. She tore off her scarf, wrapped it around his chest, and began dragging him toward her horse. The animal balked at the scent of blood, but a sharp word steadied it. She heaved the man across the saddle, climbed up behind him, and turned toward the flickering light of her ranch. By the time she reached the cabin, her fingers were stiff as bone. She kicked open the door, half carried him inside, and dropped him beside the hearth. The air smelled of smoke and pine resin. The fire had burned low, but she stoked it to life again, heat spilling through the small room. The cabin was simple, wood walls blackened by years of smoke, one iron bed, one table, one picture on the mantel. A man in uniform, the father she buried 5 winters ago. She pulled the arrow from the stranger's side with her teeth clenched. He didn't scream, only gasped once before passing out cold. Blood darkened the rag she pressed against his ribs. She cleaned the wound with snowmelt and whiskey, her hands shaking from cold and from something else, fear mixed with defiance. When she finished, she sat back and studied him in the firelight. His face was harsh, lined with dirt and dried blood, but young. Too young for the kind of scars across his chest. Outside, a wolf howled long and low. She stood, looked through the window. Nothing but white and black, snow and trees. Yet something moved near the barn, shadows slipping through stormlight. She snatched her rifle, stepped outside into the cold again, breath sharp in her lungs. The moon was a pale blur behind clouds. She saw no one, only the pine nearest the barn with something carved into its bark. A blackened handprint burned into the wood. The edges still smoked. She touched it with her glove. The ash smeared like soot. Whoever left it had been here minutes ago. Her pulse quickened. She turned back toward the house, eyes scanning the tree line. For a second she thought she saw movement, figures on horseback in the dark, but then the storm thickened again, hiding everything. Inside, the fire snapped. The Apache stirred, muttering in his sleep in a tongue she didn't know. She poured a bit of water between his lips. He coughed, eyes opening briefly. His gaze found her and stayed there, untrusting yet grateful, as if he couldn't decide which would kill him first, his wound or her kindness. "You're safe here for now," she said, though she wasn't sure it was true. He blinked, then whispered something soft, the sound almost like a prayer. She didn't ask what it meant. She sat near the fire, staring into the flames, hearing her heart pound against the silence. The storm outside pressed against the cabin walls like a living thing trying to get in. She thought of her father's voice once telling her, "Don't bring the wounded home. Wounded men bring trouble." She glanced at the stranger again, his breath shallow but steady. Trouble or not, she'd made her choice. The wind screamed again through the cracks, and the horses whinnied in fear. She loaded her rifle and leaned it by the door. Tomorrow she would see who carved that mark and why. For now, she'd keep the fire alive and watch the snow fall. The man muttered once more, eyes half opening. "Why, save me?" She didn't look at him when she answered. "'Cause no one saved me either." The flames danced across their faces, the storm swallowing the rest of the world. Somewhere in the distance, a horse neighed and a gun cracked once, then silence. She glanced toward the sound, hand on her rifle, and for the first time in years, fear felt like company. Dawn came gray and thin over the hills, the snow crusted hard as bone. Smoke curled from the chimney of the small ranch, twisting upward into the pale sky. Inside, the fire still burned, and the wounded man slept in its glow. The girl moved quietly, feeding logs to the coals, her breath soft, her movements careful as if the sound itself might break the fragile peace. She studied him from across the room, his chest rising, the fever sweat on his brow. He looked stronger this morning, yet still not whole. When he stirred, she set down the kettle and watched his eyes open slowly, confusion swimming in them before memory returned. He tried to sit up, teeth gritted against the pain. She stopped him with a firm hand on his shoulder. "Lie still," she said. "You're not fit to stand." He blinked at her voice, the steady calm of it. "Where is this place?" "My land," she said simply. "You were dying in the snow. I brought you in." He looked toward the window where light spilled through cracks in the shutter. "You shouldn't have," he muttered. "They'll come back." She poured water into a tin cup, handed it to him. "Let them," she said, her voice steady, not boastful, just certain. "I've dealt with worse than ghosts." His gaze lingered on her, taking in the dirt under her nails, the half-healed cuts across her knuckles, the hollowness beneath her eyes. He saw someone who had fought her own kind of war. "You don't know who you're helping," he said quietly. "Don't need to," she replied. "You're breathing. That's enough." Outside, the silence broke, faint, distant thunder, though no storm brewed. He stiffened. "Horses?" he whispered. She moved to the window. On the far ridge, black dots moved against the snow, too many to be hunters or travelers. She turned, her face unreadable. "Friends of yours?" He shook his head once. "No. Bounty men. They were the mark, the burned hand." She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. "The same that was carved on my tree?" He nodded. "They track those who turn against their masters. Men like me." She watched the figures vanish over the ridge. "Then they'll find this place soon." For hours they prepared in silence. She filled the rifle chamber, counted her bullets. He helped where he could, fashioning crude bandages from old cloth. The air between them was thick with words unspoken. Fear, mistrust, something else neither dared name. When night fell again, she let him rest while she sat near the fire, eyes half closed, rifle across her lap. The wind shifted, bringing a new smell, smoke. She rose instantly. Through the frost on the window she saw it, a thin column rising from the barn. She kicked the door open, ran into the cold. Flames licked at the wooden beams, the horses shrieking inside. She grabbed a bucket, threw snow into the blaze, coughing on the smoke. Behind her, the Apache stumbled from the cabin, clutching his side but standing. "Get back inside," she shouted. He ignored her, pulling a pistol from his belt. A shot cracked through the air, then another. A bullet struck the post beside her head, splintering the wood. She ducked, returned fire, the recoil jolting through her arm. Shadows moved at the edge of the light. Men, half a dozen, firing from the tree line. He fired beside her, steady despite the pain. They moved together, wordless, instinctive, covering each other as the fire grew. One man broke from the trees, charging forward. She dropped him with a single shot. The snow steamed around the body, red spreading across white. When it was over, the silence rang louder than the gunfire. The barn smoldered, one wall collapsed, horses gone wild. She stood trembling, chest heaving, smoke in her lungs. The Apache leaned against a post, bleeding again but still upright. "They'll come again," he said hoarsely. She looked around, the ruined barn, the black smoke staining the stars. They already did. Inside, she poured whiskey over his wound. He didn't flinch this time. "You've killed before," he said, almost as a statement. "Once or twice," she replied, voice hollow. "Not something I boast about." He nodded slowly. "In my tongue we say each death stays on your skin. You can't wash it off, only carry it." She looked at her hands, the calluses, the faint tremor. "Then I must be covered head to toe." He smiled faintly, not with joy but understanding. "Same as me." They sat in silence, fire snapping between them. The room smelled of smoke, blood, and rain about to fall. Outside, the wind quieted, the night strangely calm. When he spoke again, his tone was different, almost gentle. "Why live out here alone? A place this cold can swallow you whole." She hesitated. "Because there's nowhere else left that doesn't remind me of graves." He said nothing more, only nodded, eyes closing as exhaustion took him. She watched the rise and fall of his chest, the small flicker of life she'd chosen to protect. She thought of the men who had burned her barn, of the handprints still smoldering on the tree, and knew this was only the beginning. She stood, added another log to the fire. The flames caught, throwing light over his sleeping face, over the rough-hewn walls, over the rifle resting near her chair. The cabin felt smaller now, the air heavier. The peace between them was fragile, a pause between storms. She went to the window, looked out into the endless white. Somewhere beyond those hills, men were loading rifles, following tracks in the snow that led straight to her door. She could almost feel their eyes already on her, waiting for dawn. She turned back to the fire, the warmth brushing her face. "Let them come," she whispered to no one. Outside, a single ember from the barn drifted into the night sky, glowing red against the gray, then vanishing into darkness. The girl watched it fade, then closed the shutter and sat beside the stranger she'd chosen not to abandon. The storm had ended, but the war had only just begun. The snow had softened by morning, turning the valley into a white sea that shimmered under pale sunlight. Smoke no longer rose from the barn, only thin black streaks across the horizon. The rancher girl packed what little remained, dried meat, bullets, a small pouch of coins, and saddled her horse. The Apache stood near the corral, leaning slightly, his face drawn but determined. His wound had closed, though pain still lived in the way he breathed. When she handed him a second rifle, he hesitated before taking it. "You don't have to ride with me," she said, tightening the strap on her saddle. He met her eyes. "If I stay, they come again. If I go, they still come. Might as well face them standing." She gave a short nod, mounted up, and turned toward the open plain. The sky stretched wide and empty above them, the color of steel. They rode in silence for hours, the only sounds the crunch of hooves and the faint whistle of wind through dry brush. Every few miles she'd glance back to see his horse trailing just behind hers, steady, quiet, always watching the horizon. When they stopped by a frozen creek to water the horses, he knelt, dipped his hand into the icy flow. "You live with ghosts," he said. She looked at him sharply. "You talk like a preacher." He shook his head. "No preacher would have lasted out here. I can see it on you, the dead that follow." She crouched beside him, scooping water into her palm. "Then you see too much. They don't follow me. I keep them close." He didn't answer. The wind rose again, carrying the faint echo of crows. He looked eastward. "They'll take the valley trail. It's faster. We'll head through the ridge. Fewer tracks, less chance they find us." They mounted again, climbing through a narrow pass where rock walls rose like jagged teeth on either side. The world felt tighter there, the air heavy with old silence. Snowmelt trickled down the stone, glinting in the weak light. As they rode, she asked, "Why were they hunting you?" His jaw tightened. "I used to ride with them, scouts for the railroad. They wanted to burn out what was left of my people's camps, take the land clean. I refused. They burned my brother's village instead." His voice cracked once, low and bitter. "I took one of their men's scalps and ran. Now they call me traitor." She stared ahead, eyes narrowing. "The railroad took my father's land too. Said it wasn't ours no more." He didn't stand down. "They shot him in the yard." He turned toward her, something fierce passing through his gaze. "Then we both owe the same blood." They reached the top of the ridge by dusk. From there, the world spread wide, frozen plains, black rivers of pine, smoke rising faintly far below. She spotted a cluster of half-collapsed buildings, a mining town abandoned since the silver ran dry. "We'll rest there," she said. Inside the saloon, dust lay thick as snow, old bottles still on the shelves. They lit a small fire in the hearth, warmth seeping into their frozen hands. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to exhale. He sat across from her, the firelight painting his face in red and gold. "You trust me now?" he asked quietly. She studied him a long moment. "I trust what I've seen. You could have left me when the barn burned. You didn't." He nodded once. "And you could have left me in the snow." The air between them settled into something quiet and fragile. She reached for her canteen, poured him a drink. He took it, their fingers brushing for a heartbeat before parting again. Outside, the wind hummed through broken shutters like a ghost sigh. Then came the sound, horses. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. She froze, hand already on her rifle. He rose slowly, eyes sharp. "They found us." In seconds they were moving, lamps snuffed, rifles loaded. Shadows flickered outside the saloon windows, voices carried on the wind. She peeked through a crack and saw them, 5 men, one bearing the same burned hand mark on his coat. They spread around the building like wolves circling prey. The first shot shattered the silence. Glass exploded, wood splintered. She dropped behind a table, firing through the doorway. He took the upper floor, shooting from a broken balcony. Gunfire echoed through the hollow town, flashes lighting the walls like lightning. The smell of powder filled the air. One man fell near the door, another near the well. But there were more coming. She could hear the hoofbeats pounding closer. He shouted from above, "Downstairs now!" She moved for the stairs just as the floor burst beside her, a bullet grazing her arm. Pain tore through her shoulder, hot and sharp. She stumbled but kept running. He met her halfway, grabbed her good arm, pulled her toward cover. His face was pale but calm, voice low and steady. "Stay with me." They burst through a back door, stumbling into the cold. Snow whirled around them as the last of the gang fired from the main street. She turned, aimed, and dropped one with her final bullet. Silence returned, sudden and heavy. When it was done, only the two of them remained standing. The saloon windows glowed faintly behind them, the fire within flickering low. She sank to her knees, breathing hard. He crouched beside her, pressing his hand over her wound to stop the bleeding. "They'll keep coming," she said between breaths. He shook his head. "Not these men. But others, maybe." He reached into a dead man's coat, pulling out a crumpled letter sealed with wax. She watched as he unfolded it, scanning the words. His eyes darkened. "It's from a Colonel Avery," he said. "He's paying them to hunt anyone tied to the raids years back. Your father's name is here. And mine." Her pulse quickened. Then it was the same man. The same war. He looked up, the fire's glow reflecting in his eyes. "Then we ride to end it." Outside, the wind stilled for the first time in days. Snow fell gently, covering the bodies, the tracks, and every scar the land refused to heal. She rose slowly, wincing at her wound, and met his gaze with quiet resolve. The night ahead stretched dark and endless, but for the first time neither of them was alone in it. Snow had nearly stopped falling by the time dawn broke over the ridges, but the silence that followed wasn't peace, it was the kind that came before blood. The girl sat by the hearth, wrapping fresh bandages around the Apache's ribs, her hands trembling not from cold but from the knowledge that men would come for him. His breath came rough and uneven, but his eyes stayed sharp, studying the wind through the cracks of the cabin wall as though he could read death's approach in it. "You should have left me out there," he rasped, voice barely above a whisper. She didn't look at him, only tightened the knot on the cloth and said, "You said they'd kill me too. I figure if that's true, then we might as well make it worth something." He watched her then, not as a savior, not as a fool, but as someone who had already chosen her side long before understanding the cost. Outside, the land stretched pale and endless, the snow hiding all sins but not the tracks that led to them. The horizon trembled with heatless light, and the faint echo of horses carried through the still air. They both heard it. He tried to rise, grimacing through the pain, but she pressed him back gently. "You can't fight them like this." He smiled without warmth. "Then you fight for me, little rancher?" Her jaw tightened. "I fight for what's right." He gave no answer, but the way his gaze softened told her he understood. By midday the wind shifted. Through the gaps in the boards, they saw the dark dots moving in formation. Riders, for at least, cutting through the whitened hills like wolves on a trail. She checked her rifle, loaded the last of the cartridges and moved to the window. The Apache sat up despite the pain, holding a hunting knife, the last weapon he still trusted. As the riders drew closer, their voices carried, laughing, crude, certain of their power. They were bounty men from the fort, men who killed for coin and whiskey. One of them shouted her name, mocking, telling her to send the red dog out and no harm would come to her. The lie stung sharper than the cold. She didn't move. The Apache's voice came steady this time. "If they take me, they'll make it slow. You don't want to see that." "I won't," she said simply. The first shot cracked through the air, shattering the corner of the window. Splinters rained around her face. The girl ducked low, aimed and fired back. The kick of the rifle jolted through her shoulder, but she didn't miss. The nearest rider slumped sideways off his horse. The others scattered, returning fire. The sound of bullets against wood echoed like thunder in the cabin. He pulled himself to his feet, blood soaking the side of his shirt. "Give me the gun," he demanded. "You'll fall before you fire twice." He stepped closer, eyes burning with defiance. "Then let me fall fighting." Their gazes locked. The silence between them said everything. The gratitude, the regret, the impossible bond formed between two people who should have never crossed paths. She handed him the rifle without a word. Outside, the riders regrouped, circling like vultures. The wind picked up again, swirling snow and dust, hiding them in brief bursts of white. When the first man kicked open the door, the Apache was already waiting. 2 shots, then a third, and the world went deaf with gunfire. She joined him, firing through the doorway, through the chaos and screams. One man made it inside, slashing with a knife. She struck him across the face with the rifle but then pulled the trigger point blank. His body hit the floorboards, staining the snow that drifted in from the open door. When the smoke cleared, only silence remained. 3 of them lay dead. 1 horse still fled down the ridge. The Apache dropped to one knee, the rifle slipping from his hands. She caught him before he fell, pressing her palm against the wound reopening in his side. His eyes found hers, steady, soft, proud. "You fought like a warrior," he whispered. "You taught me," she said. He smiled faintly. "Maybe I just reminded you what you already were." Outside, the snow began to fall again, quiet and slow, covering the bodies, softening the bloodstains. She dragged the dead to the edge of the ravine, working through the pain in her shoulders and hands, while the Apache watched from the doorway, too weak to move but unwilling to rest. When it was done, she returned inside and sat beside him, feeding the fire back to life. Night came gentle. The storm had passed. He spoke after a long silence. "They won't stop. Others will come. I know. You could still leave." "I could," she said. "But I won't." The fire cracked between them. He reached out, touching her wrist lightly, the gesture barely a whisper of contact. "In my people's tongue, when someone saves your life, it binds you to them. Not as debt but as blood. I thought I had none left." Her eyes softened. "Then maybe it's time to start again." He looked at her, at the flicker of light painting her face gold and shadow, and for the first time, the fear in his gaze melted into something gentler. Trust, maybe even peace. They sat that way for a long time, until his head leaned against her shoulder, breath slowing, eyes closing not from death but from the exhaustion of survival. She didn't move, just kept watch, the rifle resting across her lap, the storm outside fading into distant wind. When morning came, the world was white and still. No riders. No tracks. Only the faint print of 2 souls who had chosen to stand their ground. As the sun rose, she whispered, half to him, half to the open plains, "Go away, they'll kill you too," you said. "Maybe they still will. But if they do, at least they'll know I was here." The land stretched wide before her, merciless, eternal, and somehow tender. She led the horse out from the stable, helped him mount with careful strength, then followed beside him down the ridge. Together they rode toward the rising sun, 2 figures fading into light, leaving behind smoke, ghosts, and the quiet promise of something worth living for. And if you were sitting by that fire tonight, hearing this tale told low and slow, you'd know it ain't just about love or bullets or snow. It's about how sometimes the hardest souls are the ones still learning to be soft, and how even in the wildest land, redemption finds those stubborn enough to fight for it.